So good morning and welcome to U.S. Asia Law Institute's Asia Law Weekly, which is a series of weekly conversations about Asia and law that now lives online. I am Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the Institute, and our speaker this week is Rebecca McKinnon, an author and researcher of Internet governance and human rights on the Internet. And she's going to talk with us about the latest venue for U.S.-China tensions, which is social media apps. But before I begin, I want to mention two other upcoming U.S. Asia Law Institute events. Next Wednesday in this time slot, our speaker will be Tom Ginsberg of the University of Chicago, who is talking about China and authoritarian international law, and that also starts at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. And on Tuesday, October 6th, starting at 8:30 Eastern Time, we are holding an online tribute to the founder of our institute and the founder of the Contemporary American Study of Chinese Law, Jerry Cohen. Jerry celebrated his 90th birthday in July and has formally retired as our faculty director and as an NYU law professor. But as many of you probably know from reading his work, he's busier than ever teaching an online seminar at the New School, and he's publishing essays more or less weekly. So retirement is really a legality rather than a change of life for Jerry, but we're still taking advantage of this moment to celebrate him, and we hope that, that all of his friends will join. Information about signing up for both of those events is at our website. So today's speaker, Rebecca McKinnon, has been studying new media with a special focus on China since the early '80s. She studied and worked in China for many years, and then nearly 20 years ago began to research what at the time was a new phenomenon, citizen journalism, or blogging as we call it. And she co-founded an amazing website called Global Voices Online, which is a nonprofit citizen media community. And since then, she has written many analyses about the internet, free speech, internet regulation, published a book in 2012 called Consent of the Networked, which, and Rebecca, you can tell me if this is a fair summation, seem to try to shift the narrative about the role of the internet and social media in communications and in civic life, from the original very optimistic sunny view that this was a platform for the voiceless, a tool for democratic revolutions, to say it can be all of that, but it can also bring other things along with it. It can be a tool for authoritarians, and governments and companies can track people, can control what they do online, wake up and pay attention. I read it, at any rate, as a wake-up call for more attention to internet governance. And I mention that at some length because I think that message is very relevant to today's discussion about TikTok and Wechat and what does look like a kind of a Cold War on social media. So, so Rebecca, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you. I have to say, before you launch into your first question, thanks so much for having me, and it's really great to be reconnected after so many years. We first got to know each other when we were both journalists in Beijing in the 90s. I was with CNN, you were with AP, and you know, we were all dealing with surveillance and censorship in our own ways over there. So it's the world has evolved in surprising ways, and it's great to be having this conversation with you today.
In retrospect, I've always been very relieved that the surveillance then was not as thorough and competent and had fewer tools than today.
Yeah, it's who would have thought that it would be worse today than then.
Than then, yes. Well, I wanted to start by asking you about a comment that I saw you made in a recent interview about TikTok and Wechat and the presidential executive orders to essentially ban them from the United States, certainly from app stores. And you said that you haven't personally downloaded them on your phone because they're too risky. I think that your exact words were that I would never put WeChat on my phone for security reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, what risks do you see from WeChat and TikTok? And are these risks to you as a user, or are these security risks, national security risks?
Thanks, Kathy, for starting with that. And it's very personal risk. So, as I was a journalist in China for much of the 90s, and as you noted, in the thousands, I was researching, online activism, and the what in the thousands was an emerging blogosphere in China. What happened to that is another topic, but I was living in Hong Kong for a while, as a researcher on the topics that related to the book I eventually wrote. So I had a lot of contact and communication with. I have had a lot of contact and communication with people who then end up in your Gmail contacts and in your phone contacts, and various aspects of your network that is on your phone in different ways. And I would not, if you install WeChat, your contacts are available to the Public Security Bureau, or at least to some authorities in China, if your network is of interest to the Chinese authorities. And so it did not feel to me, it has not felt to me like a responsible thing to do, to put WeChat on my phone for that very reason. So it has less to do with a threat to my own person. I'm in Washington, D.C., standing here on my balcony this fine morning. There are other things that I find much more threatening, related to the debate I heard last night, that makes me want to stay in bed all day and curl up in a fetal position. But the security threats to me, related to WeChat, really relate to exposing my contacts to I would say serious threat that would be irresponsible. And so for that reason, I have not put WeChat on my phone. And if I were to use WeChat, I'd have to get what they call a burner phone, connected to with a number that is not known, is unlikely to be known to any Chinese authorities to be connected to me, and would use it on that basis. But that would require a great deal of time and effort to set up properly, so that I could feel that I was using it responsibly. And I have not deemed it sort of worth doing at this point in time. Maybe someday I might. And it deeply saddens me, because there are some friends of mine in China who, don't use email anymore. All they use, the only way to reach them is through WeChat, unless you attempt to call them on their cell, which is not very easy to do and also problematic. So as a result, I've lost touch with a number of people, and that deeply saddens me. But this is the world we're in today. So I guess the point is that, this particular security situation, I don't know if it has much to do with national security, but it's an example of one person's threat model, as it were. The threat model that is unique to me, and the threat I see from, if you use a particular commercial platform, which government has access, has direct access to communications on that platform servers, and does that access by that government pose a threat to yourself or to people that you have contact with? And in my case, Yes, and the question is there a way to mitigate that sufficiently to still use WeChat on my phone? The answer, no, and therefore I don't use it. So that's a long explanation, but I think it kind of speaks to the issue here of we have these corporate platforms that are intermediaries between individuals and their need to communicate and organize and do business and everything we do, and governments that regulate these platforms, and for law enforcement, national security reasons, have access to have the ability to access these platforms' communications, users' information to varying extents, depending on what the legal system is and depending on how much oversight and accountability there is in a particular system. And in China, don't need to explain to this crowd the lack of accountability or the record of human rights abuses, and so therefore it's particularly problematic. But I guess speaking of, was the WeChat ban, the wholesale ban on WeChat an appropriate response to a security issue? And are there national security issues related to WeChat? So there's a few. One has to do with, well, if you have millions of people using WeChat who are outside of China, who are connected to one another, and students, business people, people who weren't journalists and don't work on human rights, who go back and forth to China and need to use WeChat just in order to function, that's a tremendous gold mine of profiles of people and connections and activities that can be of great use to a government that's seeking to kind of track trends, manipulate opinion of people overseas that interact with China, and so on, and to surveil the activities of persons of interest, right, or kind of networks of interest. So there is certainly a security issue that could be considered a national security issue, and also just an issue of kind of human security against abuses of power by a government. And certainly WeChat has different terms of service for its overseas. If you set up the WeChat account outside of China, the terms of service and privacy policies that apply to you are actually different than if you set up your account from inside China with a Chinese number. So they moderate the content a little less aggressively, for the outside China accounts. They claim that there's more, the privacy policies appear to be more robust, but of course we can't audit and verify that they're actually abiding by them. But you just have to kind of trust that there's some good faith there, which, based on the Chinese government's track record, that's problematic. So yes, there are concerns. The question is kind of blocking WeChat or blocking any particular app around which there are concerns a response that's going to achieve both the objective of protecting national security and also protecting individual security.
Yeah. Could I interject a question there?
Right.
Because before we get to the does it work, right? Does it achieve the goal question? I want to just park that for a second and say, you've laid out a very strong argument for why you've made the choice not to put WeChat or TikTok on your phone. What about me? What if I look at the risks and say, I want to make a different choice?
Sure.
I understand that they will have my contact list, but maybe I think my contacts are fine, or maybe I don't have many contacts, or maybe I have gone to the trouble of getting that burner phone or whatever, but I've assumed the risk and I've made my choice. Should I not be allowed to make the choice to use this app?
I think you should. I agree with the judge's block on the block on First Amendment grounds. You know, especially with WeChat, you know, in order to do business, you know, there's a lot of people who are using WeChat for all kinds of reasons. I think having transparency requirements, having, you know, security audit requirements, imposing other requirements on platforms that would help the users understand what's happening, and also that would require the companies to be more clear, both with regulators in this country and with users about what's happening to people's data, about their relationship with the Chinese government, would enable people to make more informed choices. But the problem is if we get into just saying, okay, you know, we're going to block this app and we're going to block that app wholesale, we are going down the path where a globally interconnected, interoperable internet, you know, basically governments can say, I'm exercising my sovereignty over the internet in my borders. I'm going to block what I want. And, you know, too bad. And what that means for what, you know, if you're embracing sort of a doctrine of internet sovereignty, then what that leads to is Belarus saying, well, you know, you have the right to block whatever you want, and so I have the right to block apps that protests are using to protest, you know, sham election results. And so the question is kind of how do we get to, how do we arrive at a better place where legitimate human rights concerns that actually haven't been addressed in internet governance and internet regulation well at all, privacy concerns that, you know, Europe has begun to try to address, but in this country are not regulated well at all. Transparency around what, you know, governments are doing. There's all kinds of requirements that you could have that are less about this app or that app or this country or that app, and say, look, you know, here are the requirements in terms of security audit, you know, that app stores should have. Here are the transparency requirements that companies need to have around what data they're handing over to what governments. And frankly, governments, you know, there should be an expectation that the home country government of a company that has access to a lot of people's data, that government should also be transparent and accountable about how it's accessing and requesting user information and so on. So, you know, there needs to be transparency across the board, and there does need to be a commitment. So yeah, it's complicated, and you know, with, you know, on the other side of the other company that's been targeted for banning is TikTok, which is more complicated because you know, it wasn't just a ban and you're out of luck. It's like, well, if you can, if there's a sale of TikTok to a U.S. entity or some kind of deal in which U.S. you know, the company's data is under U.S. control in some way, although the kind of requirements have been shifting around, that it wouldn't have to be blocked. So that has led to initially a few different proposed deals. One was, you know, Microsoft was proposing to buy TikTok, and that ended up losing out to a proposal from Oracle and Walmart, Oracle being led by staunch Trump supporters, and Microsoft being led by people who were saying that, you know, the executives at Microsoft were saying that the app was going to be subject to very robust security and transparency requirements. and impact assessment. The deal with Oracle is, there's been a lot of writing in the press about how it fails to really address the security concerns, and that the algorithm on TikTok that recommends basically, what shows up at the top of your feed. For those of you who are not TikTok users, which probably many of us, the recommendation algorithm works similarly to, on other social media platforms like Facebook, like what's showing up at the top of your feed. It's not just chronological, whoever posted most recently. It's kind of what their computer programs think is going to cause you to be most engaged on the platform and stay on it the longest, and be more likely to react and post more things and so on, because then that generates advertising revenue for advertisers who are targeting users. The companies develop very specific profiles of the users based on geography, all kinds of different traits, and sometimes inferring political preferences, and inferring all kinds of different likes and dislikes, and then providing those profiles to advertisers, who then target those people with specific messages meant to which the advertisers' research shows they're most susceptible. And so that can lead to a lot of public opinion misinformation. That type of targeting and algorithmic recommended system combined is, my research program ranking digital rights recently put out a report talking about how targeted advertising and opaque algorithmic recommendation systems are really, unless we deal with them, we cannot deal with disinformation adequately. And that's what drives TikTok's business model.
So are you?
Why I'm getting into this, though, is that the algorithm, TikTok's algorithm, which is sort of its secret sauce, there's some dispute over, how much control or insight the U.S. parties will have over that, how much control the Chinese owner ByteDance will maintain over that, and therefore kind of what ability to spread disinformation, Chinese actors might have on TikTok. But what most of the coverage does not really address is the fact that, Oracle has no experience running a social media platform. It has a core part of its business, however, is it's sort of behind the scenes data profiling and tracking, so that advertisers and the whole advertising technology industry can obtain the data they need to track people and tailor messages to people in a very effective way. So their skill set is really on data collection, tracking, analysis, and profiling.
So are you saying Oracle does Oracle have its own reasons then to want to get hold of the TikTok data? Is that what you're suggesting?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Commercially, it's a huge incentive. And, that's very valuable data, but also the opportunity, if you marry Oracle's capabilities with TikTok's algorithm, you have a vehicle for, a tremendous gold mine of certain demographics data, behavioral data, demographic data, and they can be targeted with messages. And so, putting the Chinese aside, they can be targeted with messages by anybody who's a paying customer on the TikTok platform.
So what I'm
which
hearing
can
you say,
include any number of campaigns. And given that Oracle is run by Trump supporters, there's a real question of, Facebook has banned certain platforms like Breitbart, Daily Caller, and Trump supporters have criticized Facebook for doing that. If you have a platform that's run by Trump supporters, then most likely TikTok, we don't know, but you know, in terms of what the rules will be under such a platform. And what I'm saying, I'm kind of gaming this out a little bit because we don't know what's going to happen. Actually, TikTok is run by a set of people who are actually trying pretty hard to be transparent, who are engaging a content advisory board of very diverse people, including civil rights experts and so on. But, you know, under new management, who knows? It's very clear that the Trump administration is of the view that a lot of content that has been getting blocked on Facebook and Twitter lately should not be blocked. So you potentially have a vehicle through which, at least indirectly through those who support the president, of considerable abuse of power, which our legal system at the moment offers American citizens no protection against. So the crazy thing about TikTok is not only is there kind of a threat from disinformation or manipulation and tracking from the Chinese government, but there's also the threat of domestic abuse of power. And the only thing kind of standing in between us, given that we don't have the legal frameworks to protect Americans from that kind of abuse of power, the only thing standing in between us is the integrity of whoever happens to be running the company.
So I was just going to pause there because when you spoke about WeChat, I had the understanding that the main threat from WeChat is them accessing contacts, and that threat has a peculiar quality or color to it when the potential is for a foreign government, and in this case the Chinese government, to access that information. When talking about TikTok, you're stressing the algorithm and therefore the control over what we see, what an average user gets to see or doesn't get to see. And there, I'm not hearing you as concerned about the Chinese background or ownership or Chinese involvement, but rather that this is a risk no matter which company. It could be equally risky if Oracle, as a US company, is controlling that algorithm or harvesting that data. And my question, I guess, is whether the nationality of the home office of the company or the nationality of the engineering team matters, and how it matters. How should we think about this? Because I think right now when I look at the response and both the tech community response and also sort of the media response to the whole saga of what is going on with these, I see a lot of voices calling for country neutral regulations. And I think I heard you saying the same, country neutral regulations where a certain amount of transparency is required about algorithms and use of data and so on. And I'm wondering, particularly hearkening back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, is that sufficient when you're dealing with a country like China with an authoritarian government that is we know it has certain ways of acting and certain goals and purposes. So is country neutral regulation sufficient? Is it perhaps, you know, the national security people might say it's naive? What does it matter who the country, who the owner is?
Well, it matters to the, you know, I mean, yes, the fact that a platform is headquartered in a country that has no human rights standards, you know, that has a long track record of ongoing human rights abuses, there's no accountability, and companies are prevented by their domestic law even from being very transparent about their relationship with the government. You know, in the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index that my team puts out, Chinese companies are at the bottom or near the bottom, along with some other companies from regimes that are not defined as democratic, and there's a good reason for that. And there are serious security issues associated with that. But I think, you know, the problem with the TikTok and WeChat ban, also, it's not that there isn't genuine security concern, it's that these bans were sort of political stunts. in the months prior to the election, to make a big show. And if you really want to comprehensively address a threat that, and this threat doesn't just come via a couple of different companies, apps, and technologies. You have hacking of American-owned and run platforms that have failed to secure their networks. You have, a whole set of different threat issues. You also have the issue of, just kind of because the internet is a globally interconnected system, you actually have to coordinate your action with allies, right? With your closest economic and political partners to ensure that these actions are successful and do not actually backfire. And so that hasn't happened. You have this kind of these hastily rolled out knee-jerk political responses that have commercial ramifications that are unfortunate. People in the United States scrambling to download VPNs so that they can still use these apps from the United States. It's like, whoever thought, a few months ago, it was people in Hong Kong with the national security law downloading VPNs, and now here, you're hearing from TikTok and Wechat users doing the same, and that's another issue. It's like you block them, but the people who really want to use them are still going to use them, and those are perhaps the people who, are still going to be vulnerable in different ways. And also a vector through which vulnerabilities travel onto U.S. networks. So, you have to kind of think this through in a comprehensive way. And that simply wasn't done because the motivation here is, I would say, more political than it is actually having a successful, thought through, coordinated policy that's really done an impact assessment on, how does this affect a whole set of different interrelationships, and does it end up having bringing the security benefits we really need, or does it just become yet another huge distraction from actually solving problems while scoring points? And I'm afraid that it's a lot more of that.
So let me just say here for the listeners that if you want to join in the conversation and raise questions, please put them in the question panel at the bottom. And I'm going to be looking there, and Rebecca will also be looking there, and we'll start taking your questions kind of on a running basis as we go. We won't wait till the last 30 minutes or whatever to say it's Q&A time. You can just put your questions up as we go along. So this is a good time to come back to that question that I sort of parked a little while ago of what you've said, that this is not an effective solution to the actual security risks that exist, both the personal security risks and the national security risks. What would be an effective solution? What if you were in charge of U.S. data security for a day? What would you be doing?
Well, first we need privacy law. We need strong privacy law. Right now, for commercial purposes, the way in which people's data is being collected and shared and sold or shared with advertisers as part of a transaction in which advertisers can then target people, that data then, not only is it used to sell cheese crisps or whatever, it's also going to political people, with political agendas. There's been reporting, it goes to, organizations affiliated with the NRA with marketing budgets, all kinds of things. But it also goes to, it becomes available to foreign actors and in ways that had a result that's quite well documented in 2016 in terms of the amount of foreign manipulation that happened on social media. And
during the election.
Right, during the election. and that continues to be ongoing. And you know, the New York Times did a really great feature investigation late last year in which they took commercially available data from cell phones, just what, you know, AT&T or Sprint or T-Mobile, whatever you're using, what is commercially available to a marketer on the open market, and they were able to track members of Trump's security detail, right? That is a national security. You know, our failure to regulate the data market is an absolute national security threat, and it needs to be addressed immediately. You know, this is very clear. So first of all is to work with Congress to pass a law, and there needs to be, again, security components of this. You know, third party, you need security audits. You need to inform users when there's been a data breach. There needs to be much clearer public education and outreach about you know, the part that everybody plays in preventing or exacerbating security problems, both in industry and you know, throughout our lives. You know, there need to be consequences when companies fail to secure their networks. You know, some teenage hacker obtained, you know, was able to get the login information for prominent politicians and business leaders on Twitter recently through a very simple kind of, you know, a set of spoofs, you know, kind of, they call it social engineering through the telephone. You know, companies need to be held, you know, there need to be legal repercussions when companies are failing to put in place the mechanisms that better guard against that kind of thing happening.
I guess there's a conceptual,
that's, you know, I mean, you know, so that's part of it. You know, yes, there needs to be better tracking and coordination, I think, with between sort of, you know, national security institutions and the private sector to identify where threats are and how to mitigate them. But the other problem we have, frankly, is trust on the other side. You know, you remember the Snowden revelations back in 2013. You remember Microsoft's Brad Smith called the NSA an advanced persistent threat to Microsoft's global users. And that's because there's also not enough mechanisms in place to make sure that our own government agencies don't abuse their access to private networks in ways that cause concern not only for people here in the United States and cause companies to be very wary of working with government agencies, but also cause concern, say, you know, in Europe, right? There's something called the Privacy Shield, which has just been struck down by a European court, which is the main kind of legal mechanism that enables U.S. companies to process Europeans' data, even though we don't have the equivalent of the, you know, GDPR, the data protection regulation in Europe. And that's just been struck down because there's not sufficient accountability around, you know, the extent to which U.S. agencies might be accessing European user data. And there's not enough trust in the system across borders, even among democracies, about whether or not that information of those of European citizens could be abused in some way. So there's just tremendous lack of trust throughout, you know, the systems that, when we add them together, the commercial systems that, you know, at all different layers, that we come to know is the internet that we depend on every day. And we need national leadership and a serious commitment to rebuild that trust both in this country and amongst like-minded governments that you know, while not nobody's perfect in their in exercising their commitments to human rights, are at least have that commitment and are, you know, being held accountable by their citizens in some way. And, you know, that there does need, you know, and you've probably seen this in some writing about kind of the internet and its governance, that there needs to be a stronger coalition of governments who can really articulate what kind of internet do we want to have and how we are going to ensure trust and human rights protection as well as security for internet users in a way that actually supports and sustains democracy and enables the exercise of human rights, which, you know, and to demonstrate what that stark contrast with the Chinese model and vision is. And then it will be clearer for users of Wechat or TikTok to make clear decisions about the kind of world I want to have. It's that one, not that one. Therefore, I'm going to use these platforms that are in line with the vision of the world I want to have, and not those platforms that are in line with the vision I really don't want for my kids. But we don't have that right now. We have sort of whateverism, and, you know, well, you know, they're doing it, so we should do this, and, you know, and kind of short-term knee-jerk reactions. And it's hard. It's you know, this is a fundamental question of governance and democracy that is not new in the internet age, right? How do you secure society? How do you provide governance that gives your citizens the security they need to exercise their rights in a way that doesn't violate their rights? Right?
Yeah, this was the complicated question that you were raising in the 2012 book already. So as you say, it's not new. And in that book, I read you as calling for a kind of what I think of, you know, from a legal perspective, as a constitutional moment for the internet. You know, your title was Consent of the Networked, and obviously referring to the consent of the governed, and the idea that we need to come together and actually do the hard work of thinking from the ground up, what should our constitutional structure on the internet be? What should the rules be? What should the balance of power be? And trust and transparency as a part of that. Of course, that's a very complicated job that's in good times where there was more social trust, when relationships with allies were smoother, when there just was less noise in the whole system. That would still be a big challenge. And it didn't happen in the 90s, in the very early days of the internet, when there were already some calls for that sort of constitutional thinking. How should we regulate the internet? Oh, don't worry about it, we don't need it. There were voices saying we should. Didn't happen. That was a more, there was a little less noise in the system and smoother relations with many allies at that time, although I don't want to make it too rosy in the rearview mirror, but it might have been, you know, easier then. Didn't happen in the early aughties and when you were writing that book. So now at this moment, it seems even less likely to happen that there be this kind of coming together within the US or between the US and Europe, or like-minded allies, as you say, to think through systems. So I don't feel very optimistic hearing you describe what needs to happen. Maybe you can make me feel better if you tell me the progress that has occurred in that direction. I know in a recent paper you listed a number of different, I don't know whether to call them protocols, policies, agreements,
principles,
various documents that in many cases it's civil society has come up with, sometimes industry groups. So we're not starting from total zero. There are some pieces of constitutional thought out there that we could use. Yes. So what does that look like right now? What the work that's already been done? To what extent is the U.S. involved in that? To what extent are companies involved?
Well, so yeah, you're referring to. I wrote it. I had a fellowship with the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and I wrote a paper for them, and it's on their website there. But as you say, in part of the paper, I worked with a researcher who helped me sort of map out over the past 15, 20 years, really 20 years, you know, every once in a while somebody's like, we need to have a Magna Carta for the internet. We need to have a Declaration of Human Rights for the internet, right? And so there's all these documents, you know, with various groups around something called the Internet Governance Forum, you know, kind of civil society groups from lots of different countries, actually, you know, who've come together and said, you know, okay, based on human rights norms, you know, what types of regulations do we want from governments and what types do we not want if we want a human rights compatible internet? And we've sort of mapped out some of the common threads around that, or sort of the common asks. And you know, again, not we don't have time to sort of list all of them, but a lot of it relates to, okay, we need freedom of expression. That doesn't mean free for all. That means freedom of expression in the context of human rights. And so, you know, when governments are regulating the internet in ways that affect expression online, there needs to be a human rights impact assessment of, like, when you're trying to regulate copyright or you're trying to regulate terrorist content, that you're doing it in a way that is not harming freedom of expression. You need to coordinate it with other governments that share the same values, that kind of thing. Things like surveillance. It needs to be necessary and proportionate. Not that you can't have surveillance. Not that there isn't a role for national security agencies, but surveillance needs to be specific to the crime, to the investigation. That blanket surveillance, you know, sucking up everything, that keep it around in case you need it later, is not compatible with human rights. Encryption is necessary for the exercise of human rights in terms of the ability of investigative journalists to be able to do their job, increasingly even in this country, let alone, say, Syria, or something. But you know, the point being is there's sort of common asks that a broad global human rights community, with some companies also involved, have kind of signed on to, and over the years. And there's something called the Freedom Online Coalition, which was actually launched nearly 10 years ago by Hillary Clinton as part of the State Department's Internet Freedom Agenda in the Obama administration. Remember that? And it was meant to be sort of a coalition of the willing, or sort of like the community of democracies, where governments kind of come together and say, we're committed to free and open global internet. We're committed to human rights on the internet, and we're committed to enacting and promoting policies that advance that. And actually, some of the groups that have been involved with all these, you know, treatises have engaged with the Freedom Online Coalition pretty regularly. The problem is that, you know, it's the foreign ministries, and they get together and kind of coordinate nice statements, but then they're, you know, other agencies are doing other things and don't even know that foreign ministries have made these commitments. And so it's kind of a nice statement. It's a nice commitment, but even the members are not living up to it. And really, since 26 or since January 2017, the U.S. hasn't really engaged in any but the most low-level way. You know, the U.S. is still a member, but it's a potential vehicle for doing something real, but it would require leadership from the United States. It would require leadership from some of the other European governments as well. But you know, we'll see. I mean, you know, and it's not just Europe. I mean, I was at a meeting in Ghana before the pandemic where a lot of members of parliament from Ghana were saying, you know, we need to do something. We really need the internet. You know, we need it to govern. We need it for our economy, but we have, you know, we have no control over what's happening. And civil society there likewise is saying, you know, we just have to take whatever Facebook gives us, and you know, we have no power. And so you know, for emerging democracies as well, this is really critical. But and there are some frameworks, but you certainly need leadership, which and you need commitment, and it's something that doesn't happen quickly and doesn't happen in a linear fashion.
There's a question
right now we don't have leadership or commitment.
Yeah, there's a question from Elizabeth Lynch that I think fits in here very well. She's asking with respect to regulation, specifically privacy, can you talk more about what, if anything, can be done at the state level? And by state here, of course, she means states of the U.S., not nation states.
Yeah.
So if she says California has passed better privacy regulations, does that help? So there are a number of areas of governance reform in the U.S. where in recent years, because Congress and the administration, through several administrations, have not been able to work together to actually solve, you know, to actually make reforms, you know, criminal justice, for example, and reformers have turned to the state level. And so a lot of things have happened at the state level. Is that an answer for the internet?
It's better than nothing. You know, it's better than nothing, given that, you know, Silicon Valley is in California, and therefore having some privacy law, even though it's imperfect and it's, you know, it's still an open question just how well it's actually working, and enforcement and all of that. But you know, again, it's better than nothing. My research program, Ranking Digital Rights, you go to rankingdigitalrights.org, we put out a report, a two-part series of reports earlier in the year. And if you go on the site, there's a button that says "It's the Business Model." If you click on that, you can get our recommendations for privacy law, for what needs to be in a national privacy law. You know, and there are other places where you can you know, the Open Technology Institute, our sister organization, also has kind of very detailed recommendations for what needs to be in a national privacy law. I mean, again, if the federal government can't act, the state government, you know, it's better than doing nothing, but the states can't really do the international coordination and really step up to have an international conversation that's needed. You know, you need you really do need national level and multinational level commitment and support to get where we need to go.
So another question is coming at it from a different angle. Should we be focusing on breaking up the corporate actors, breaking up the tech monopolies in order to make them more readily regulatable?
Well, I think that we're certainly heading in that direction, given that you know, it's not working so well at the moment. We need competition. People need to be able to have alternatives. You know, whether or not Facebook and Google and other companies fit the, you know, the legal definition of a monopoly, as far as our lives are concerned, as they are monopolies. As you know, in de facto, whether, you know, whatever the legal arguments are technically, and this means we don't have alternatives that are viable. We need regulation that also requires platforms to be interoperable, that I should be able to take my data from one platform and put it onto another that has policies that I feel are better protective of my rights and interests. but you need to have more competition for these platforms even to exist. And because of the lack of enforcement of even existing antitrust law, new nascent startups just get bought by the big guys over and over, and that's not healthy.
There's a question about the Internet of Things, which of course gets extremely complicated fast. And I think everybody by now is familiar with this concept that your thermostat and your refrigerator or your microwave, your baby monitor, all of these digital devices are actually online as well and could be spying on you and sharing information about you. And they're mostly made by no-name OEM companies, many of them actually in Shenzhen, that are often not providing updates, patches, that kind of thing. I am aware of this problem, but I have no idea myself how to update software on these devices, and it's very difficult to read the small print and figure out even how to do anything other than just plug it in and use it.
It's
what
a
is
huge
the solution
problem
for privacy?
I mean, again, you can have regulation that says, you know, a device is sold in this market needs to have X, Y, and Z security features. They need to, you know, have certain policies. They need to be audited for, you know, that you can make requirements. Just like we've had seatbelt requirements and, you know, any number of other safety requirements on any number of products. You can impose requirements. We've just not imposed any, right? I mean, there was a crazy story a couple of years ago about there was a hack of financial data that was pulled off through through an internet-connected thermometer in a fish tank in a casino in Reno. Whoa, you know. But you know, speaking of more kind of mainstream stuff, you know, a lot of people have these doorbells ring, you know, and other kind of home security platforms that are then sharing data with kind of neighborhood social networks that then share data with law enforcement, and it's completely untransparent. And it's also unclear who can buy this commercially on the market. You know, is this also going into the pool of data that advertisers are able to access? So, and there's just total lack of transparency. You know, with some products, you can sort of opt out if you discover that this is an issue and that figure out where to click to opt out. But, you know, a lot of privacy advocates say that, you know, you should have to opt in to the collection of any data that's not essential for the working of the service and the sharing of it. At the moment, it's just total. We could regulate this. Congress could act. There are some draft bills kicking around. There's a number of them been kicking around for quite some time. So, you know, we'll see what happens in the next Congress and who's in the next Congress.
Well, which government agency would be the appropriate place to be executing anything that Congress put forward? So if we wanted, for example, to have an agency that was acting to enforce, to carry out a mandate to, for example, audit Internet of Things devices to make sure that they were complying, or to audit the data handling practices of some of the social media platforms or data collection platforms, would it be Commerce? Where would that go?
Well, you know, there's, you know, the FTC has been kind of historically the place that enforces privacy to the extent that the law protects it. There are those who called for the creation of a new agency. There are those who've called for just beefing up existing government institutions so that they have the resources. You know, again, in the financial system, there's a great deal of auditing that happens because, you know, there's been political will and commercial incentives to keep things secure. So it's not like auditing and verification can't happen, or that we don't know how to do it. You know, for again, you can take it and you can house the work in different ways. The point is that you know, the way financial audits happen is that it's not the government that's auditing your accounts. It's like Ernst and Young or somebody, right? But they have to be certified by the government, and then that audit has to be available to regulators, right? So it's not like you can't bring in businesses to help you with audits, and that you have to fund all of it with taxpayer money. But you know, auditing is not a new concept.
Can you tell us about the Clean Network initiative that the State Department announced, I think at the beginning of this summer, and they actually said online that it dates back earlier, but it's definitely bigger than TikTok and WeChat. And do you have a sense of what they're trying to accomplish, big picture? What is the end game of the Clean Network initiative?
Well, I mean, this is targeting Huawei, and obviously, you know, I think somebody in the chat was pointing out that, you know, the level of security concern between WeChat and TikTok is different, and Huawei, you know, which supplies networking equipment to internet and mobile carriers around the world, in addition to selling phones and other things. You know, there's been an ongoing debate for a long time about the extent to which the Chinese government has access to communications going across networks that are supported by Huawei equipment, that include Huawei equipment in them. And Huawei has failed to, you know, do enough to reassure people that that they don't have to worry about this. So there are some, again, legitimate concerns about Huawei. What the State Department has done with the Clean Network program, and you know, we can talk about that use of language, and I have some friends who are historians who have some issues with that. But in any case, you know, it's basically, you know, so the clean, it's very Chinese. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 cleans, right? It's the 6 cleans, and you know, clean carrier, clean store, clean apps, clean cloud, clean cable, and you know, so it's all about making sure that, you know, a carrier or an app store, or you know, an app or a cloud, a computing system, or an undersea cable system does not in any way touch Chinese networks. And you know, that basically, to ensure that U.S. networks, U.S. apps, U.S. cloud services are not connected in any way to Chinese untrusted carriers, or Chinese untrusted apps or servers, or so on. And so
only
it kind
Chinese.
of, yes, only Chinese. So if there's some other country that's doing bad things, you know, I guess we don't mind. But you know, and the Internet Society came out with a statement, and they tend to be, you know, they make positions kind of based on what they think is good for the technical security and interoperability of the internet. They're not hugely political. And you know, they came out with a statement, you know, warning that this policy is going to fracture the internet, in that, you know, because part of what they do is support the technical coordination functions that enable the networks to talk to each other, so that when I send an email, let's say I'm visiting Iceland, and I send the email to Germany and to Tokyo and to Hong Kong, that it actually gets there, you know, within seconds, not hours or days, right? And that the same thing gets there and nobody can sort of change it on the way. And you know, and also just you know, the amount of technical coordination required to ensure that when I type in CNN.com anywhere on the planet, unless somebody is blocking it, the same website comes up, not different versions of it, you know, unless that's CNN intention. But you know, the same website controlled by the same entity comes up no matter where I am. And that actually requires a great deal of technical coordination, which requires networks from all different types of countries to connect with one another. And once you start saying, you know, this country, that country can't be part of it, you will fracture the internet. And it also invites other countries to do the same thing. It's like, okay, you know, I'm Turkey, and I don't like this country and that country, so you know, no technology can touch my networks from this country and that country. You know, basically, you know, their concern is that it's the beginning of the end, and that, you know, there are certainly serious security issues across networks that there are technical bodies kind of fighting over how to address them all the time. And it's also true that, you know, Chinese engineers have gotten more engaged in those conversations, you know, on behalf of their employers, who are, of course, in line with their government. But, you know, there's other ways to engage with those conversations to ensure that there is sufficient security in the way that the internet works across the world, and that this, in the internet society's view, is not it. So again, it's another example of a political stunt that, you know, is simple and, you know, chillingly kind of, you know, with the 6 cleans, sounds eerily familiar to those of us who spent time studying Xi Jinping thought and other things. But you know, I mean, the point is here that, yes, you know, securing, you know, provide for government to do its job, it needs to protect people from threats, right? But, you know, if you're a democracy, your job is also to protect people's rights and not turn yourself into China or into a mirror image of China while you're trying to counter threats from China, right? And that's ultimately the problem here. Is, yeah, you know, using national security as an excuse to, yes, address national security threats, but while you're at it, you know, address your opponents is you know, a well-worn path. And the concern here is that we're starting to go down it.
Yeah, so just to focus for a minute on that, when I read about the Clean Network Initiative, it made me think of course, of China's Great Firewall, where, you know, which is our nickname for all of the collection of various steps and measures that China has taken to seal off its own country's internet, so that in effect it's kind of like a big intranet. It's almost like if I'm sitting in a company and my employer has an intranet, and only those of us inside the company access this information, and my company might tell me, while you're at work, you can't go look at your Yahoo email or your Gmail, or you can only be on our corporate email, because we don't want anything, you know, we want to be very secure, and we don't want any of our information to leak out via these channels of these other applications. So China has built the wall around itself to have a kind of a national intranet, but it's not entirely cut off, but there's a lot of separation. Now, from the opposite side of that wall, we have the U.S. saying, we too want to separate from you. So the moat around China then sort of widens even more. And when you add these two phenomena together, if the U.S. goes down the road of pursuing initiatives that are intended to achieve the 6 cleans that you mentioned, and intended to ensure that U.S. networks are not, do not operate in any way, do not touch on Chinese networks, Chinese equipment, and so on, then what would the future look like for people inside China communicating and interacting with people outside China, in the U.S. maybe in particular, but really anywhere? Would we not be communicating? Would we not be emailing? What would still be possible, do you think, if the Clean Network Initiative succeeded? What would that world look like?
Yeah, well, it'll be even harder. So, maybe you have to go on a plane and go meet with people in person and leave your cell phone behind and talk in a field. I don't know, yeah, I mean, the whole point of the internet, I mean, I think you and I were both in China when the internet showed up there, and how incredible it was, both, what it meant for our jobs as journalists, but, any expat in China being able to do their job, just transformed everything, right? Finance, everything, culture. And so if the walls are going up,
China too. It transformed Chinese society as well, not just expats living in China.
Absolutely, fundamentally. And so, on the one hand, no, we can't be naive, right? And I, you mentioned my book, and I was one of the early people to say, let's not be naive. Just because China has the internet doesn't mean it's going to democratize. It's actually doing a pretty good job of adapting the internet to the Chinese. The Chinese Communist Party is actually doing a pretty good job of co-opting industry and adapting the internet to its needs to bolster its power. And that was sort of an unpopular view at the time. People were like, oh, well, all we need is more VPNs and the Communist Party will fall. So we can't be naive on the one hand that all you need is more connectivity and you don't have to worry about privacy or, human rights concerns or risks to users or anything. And, history will ultimately prevail on the side of democracy, which was frankly a very naive attitude on the part of Yahoo and some of the other early internet companies that went in there. So that, on the one hand, but on the other hand, if you're just saying, okay, China CCP bad, everything China bad, everything China blocked, Americans can't communicate with Chinese because there might be some security issues, or occasionally one of those Chinese people might be a spy, or et cetera. You're really, I just can't see how that's going to serve the human rights of people in China, or the rights of Americans, or global prosperity, or anything else. So yeah, it's troubling. We're not going in a good direction. I sort of warned, nearly 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, when I wrote my book, that the conventional wisdom was that the internet would democratize everybody, but based on kind of corporate behavior, government behavior, kind of, the trends that I was seeing, that actually, unless everybody took responsibility for moving the internet in a different direction, the internet around the world was going to look more and more like China's.
Well, this is a collective action problem, right? I mean, this is kind of classic collective action problem. For me, as a user,
collective action problem. Yeah.
All I want to do is get on my apps. All I want to do is check my email, do what I want to do online. And you're telling me I need to go do some governance work. And I don't know.
Not everybody has to go attend, struggle sessions and meetings and stuff. But it's just like, I mean, I live in a city. You live in a city. Do I care who the mayor is? Do I care what, how my city is policed? Do I care how the city runs its transportation? Do I get involved in different ways that I have available to me to make sure that my rights are protected and that my interests are represented? Yes, because if I don't, God help me, right? And the internet is the same. It's not that, okay, you have to quit your job and become a full-time internet governance activist, or, right? But you have to think of, in terms of what you're choosing to use, how you use it, how you vote, how you invest, how you consume. You have to be thinking about, how do I use what power I have to influence these entities in ways that will enable my rights to be protected and my interests to be respected, and for power to be held accountable. And I think ultimately, really, it's a lot of it is going to come down to voting, and there's sort of the political layer of it, which is another conversation. And do we have leadership that is actually committed to protecting and respecting rights of all people, and ensuring that we have an economy that does so, digital and otherwise?
Has the Biden campaign, does their platform have anything that addresses data protection, privacy protection, internet security, WeChat, TikTok, any of the above?
I mean, there is stuff I don't have in front of me right now, but Biden has made, basically, supports, there's support for privacy law. There's been a number of general statements that obviously are going to have to get worked out in the details of politics, also to have a conversation with allies about how we ensure that networks, that global, technology and networks and companies are operating in a way that respects rights and that actually supports democracy. There are some statements, kind of some general statements to that effect. There's some Biden people who've been quoted in the media recently about the need to offer a clear alternative for what democracy compatible technology looks like. So there, is
there support in Congress for anything like that?
Well, privacy law, absolutely. There's multiple privacy bills in Congress at the moment. So I think no matter what happens in November, we're going to get privacy law. There's a lot of other debates around, what you do about disinformation, and whether it is, or whether it's free speech, or whether platforms should maintain immunity from liability for what content appears on them, and lots of really thorny questions that I think even within both parties there's not a lot of agreement, and is gonna, but I think there is recognition that there's a lot of messes that need to get addressed, not least people dying of COVID. So the governance challenges on all levels are rather huge. But I think that there is hope that if we as citizens and users of technology, investors, consumers, push for our values, that things can move in a better direction. And I guess I would just also say my father's professor of Chinese history, so just to kind of take this in a context that doesn't leave us completely depressed and hopeless and going back to bed in a fetal position. This whole question of, what do we do? How is this ever going to be fixed? The collective action problem. Over time, our societies have moved the bar. When enough people, when enough people say, I'm not going to put up with that, I want to go there, not there, and hold enough people accountable for that idea, it can move. And we're kind of, you know, in my book, I talked about how we're at a Magna Carta moment, and it wasn't that we need to draft some other document, but it's just that in terms of how we hold power accountable in the digital age, we don't have the institutions to do that effectively. How do you protect people from harm, protect their rights, and, you know, from external threats while also not violating their rights yourself? That is a hard problem. You know, the last century's governance institutions don't get us there. You know, we need innovation. We need it across borders. We need it across public and private sector. You know, I think the good news is that compared to 10 years ago, the understanding that it needs to happen is much greater than ever before. You know, I think there was not much understanding about that 10 years ago. The understanding that a lot of stuff needs to be rethought and that there's a lot of hard work ahead, I think is now there. But yeah, we're kind of at a point in history that's just going to be very, very messy and very contentious. And so, you know, we all have to play our part. And, you know, if it's not going to get resolved in our lifetimes, then at least for the next generation.
Let me just take a few more questions in the time we have left. There's a question about VPNs and whether they're safe to use. And I'm interested in this because, as you mentioned, VPNs used to be something that you would use if you were in a country like China or Iran or whatever, where you were concerned, where you were trying to get over the Great Firewall. You were trying to communicate and connect with places being blocked from the country where you were. And now Americans are increasingly using VPNs in order to access the Chinese apps or Chinese intranet. But I have read many things saying that VPN companies themselves are not necessarily safe. But they are also harvesting data. So
they sure are. Yeah. So it really depends on the company, right? You know, VPNs, the free VPNs, what do you think their business model is? You. Right? Yeah. they're you know, you're paying them not with money but with your data. And so what their policies are, what their security practices are, all of these things matter. Just because you're using a VPN doesn't mean you're safe at all. And in fact, you know, the activist community is well aware of a lot of VPNs run actually by Chinese entities for the purpose of watching what people are doing when they use VPNs, right? So, you know, it's not that you shouldn't ever use VPNs, but you have to be well aware of what your own threat model is, you know, what threats you need to protect yourself against based on who you are, and what you do, and what your needs are for communicating, you know, across all aspects of your life. And then you make decisions, and sometimes you have to make trade-offs. You know, I mean, I don't encrypt all my emails because it's a pain in the neck. And, you know, would everything be more secure? Sure, but you know, I've made a trade-off there. I only encrypt some emails, right? So you know, again, it's all about deciding how you're going to manage your own risk and threats. What's unfortunate is, you know, again, we could have privacy law that would make it illegal to run a VPN in this country that does certain things or does certain things without disclosing it. You can make it illegal to sell people's data. You know, that might mean that you'd have to pay for a VPN, you know, unless it's a nonprofit open source thing, you know.
Right.
But, you know, it's, there are, you know, all kinds of public interest trade-offs here. But yeah, beware which VPN you are using.
Right.
And who runs it, and do you trust those people?
Final question, just very quickly. Should we be having this conversation on another Chinese associated platform, Zoom?
On Zoom. Well, you know, that's
feels,
again
feels very
part
ironic
of the
to me,
right?
It feels very ironic
it's
that we're
ironic.
doing this.
You know, if we were having a conversation about forced labor in Xinjiang, I would say probably maybe, you know, and we had activists on the platform and we were planning strategy, I would most certainly say no. You know, I think for this purposes, I think our, you know, if we do a threat modeling on this particular public conversation, I think the threat is low. You've got it set up in a way that, you know, somebody can't so easily come in and hijack the entire conversation and you know, broadcast porn or something. You know, but Zoom has been forced to put in a lot of security features because people realized they couldn't trust it the way it was earlier in the year. And that's an example of a company really being forced to prove that it can be trusted. And, you know, again, you know, none of them, but that said, just because there are Chinese people involved with the company, or there are some servers in China, you know, I have too many good friends in China to say that that is a good reason to not use a product, right? But you have to be smart about in what ways are people under pressure with their government.
Yeah. Well, there are many more questions we could get into about Zoom, but I'm afraid our time is up, so we're going to have to leave it here. This has been a fascinating conversation. Lots of food for thought. Thank you so much, Rebecca McKinnon, for your time this morning on giving us a lot to think about. Thank you so much.
It was a great conversation. Thanks so much. Take care.